Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started. Welcome again to the North Central Climate and Drought Outlook for August 2020. Our speaker today is the state climatologist for Kentucky, and that is Stuart Foster out of Western Kentucky University. And just remember, if you have questions or comments, as far as that goes, you can go ahead and put them in the question section or tab on the GoToWebinar window there. Just write them in there. Some of the questions we can answer pretty quickly. Some of them we can't. So we'll try to get to those as we go. We know there's going to be a lot of interest in a couple of the subjects today, mainly the maybe aftermath or whatever you want to call it of the derecho, which hits parts of the Midwest, but we'll get to that in all due time. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Stuart, so take it away. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Doug, and welcome everyone to this month's Outlook. Again, it's been certainly a busy month. It usually is something happening around the region. So we'll try to get you up to date with everything that's been happening and a chance to look forward. So if you've been on the calls before, you're familiar with all the partners that come together to help make these webinars possible. And you can see those folks listed there. Really appreciate the opportunity to work with everyone. Our next webinar will be September 15th with the National Drought Mitigation Center will be the presenter. And as always, you can access the webinars, an archive of them at various websites, including the drought.gov, the Midwestern Regional Climate Center, the High Plains Regional Climate Center. So we're going to go over a summary of recent and current climatic conditions across the North Central region. We'll take a look at a couple of events and impacts related to those events and to climate conditions in general, and then look forward at the outlooks of what we might expect over the next month to a seasonal outlook, even looking to the winter. And on the left, you see a couple slides there, photos from north central South Dakota, some localized flooding, pretty typical this time of year. We're going to be talking about things that generally on a large scale, but within that, we have these very localized events. We can't cover all of them, but this is an example of things that may be happening locally significant throughout the region. Starting out with precipitation ranks, if we look at July on the left, the last month, and then on the right, a 3-month perspective, we can see that through much of the region, Midwest and Plains, we've been above normal in terms of precipitation, ranks that are either above to much above average, but that's not the case everywhere. And the one case that certainly stands out in the Midwest is Iowa, and Iowa seems to be hogging the news this month, so we'll come back to talk about that a little bit later. A bit drier out to the west when we get into Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, near to below average in those areas. And when we look at the 3-month totals, or rankings, I should say, patterns generally similar. It's drier in the western areas and either near to above normal or above average precipitation through most of the rest of the region. Also see a little bit of dryness in the east if you get Ohio and then pushing farther east from there. In terms of temperature ranks, this is average temperature, so we're averaging the highs and lows. You can see that through much of the region we've been above average in terms of temperatures. The plains close to average, and then a little bit warmer out in the west, in the western part of the north central region, and as where I think most of us are familiar, certainly much warmer as we go farther west outside our coverage area. And then that's been a pattern if we look over the last 3 months where it's been warmer in the western half of the region for the most part, and in the northern part. When we get down to Kentucky, Indiana, Missouri, a little bit cooler average temperatures there. Pretty informative.
And Stuart, do you want to give some indication of what those numbers actually mean, like how many meters and all that?
Yeah, that's great. So thanks, Doug. These are rankings that are based on a period of record going back to 1895. So we're looking at essentially 126 years now of record. So 126 means it would be the warmest month on record. A 1 would be the coldest month on record. And again, these are average statewide, and that works pretty well for temperature, not necessarily as well for precipitation sometimes. This next slide differentiates between the ranks for the maximum temperatures, so the average of the daily maximum temperatures across an entire state, and on the right, an average of the daily minimums. If you look at the western half of the region, and again, we're going to be talking a good bit today about the differences between what's happening in the eastern half and the western half, you can see that the maximum temperatures in the western half have been much above normal to record levels on the high temperatures, and the minimum temperatures have been very similar. So have been warmer than average, highs and lows. But when you get to certainly the eastern half of the region, it's a little bit different. The higher temperatures are closer to average, but the low temperatures are running above average. And while it's outside our region of interest, if you look at the southeast, that shows up even more clearly, where high temperatures are below average, but low temperatures are average to above average. And this is a pattern that we see this year, but we've been seeing this for a while now, if we look back over a period of time. So something to take note when we look at average temperature, there's more to it than that. Shifting on to precipitation, 30-day precipitation in terms of a departure from mean on the left, and as a percentage of the mean on the right. So given that there's a precipitation gradient from east to west, we'll show both, and the patterns are somewhat similar. You can see that there's a large swath from the eastern portion of the north central region across the plains, so getting Kentucky, southern part of Ohio, Missouri, all the way over through Kansas, that we've seen above normal or above average precipitation over the last 30 days. And as a percent of normal, in some cases, we're looking at 200% or more of normal in terms of precipitation. And again, when you look at some of these localized storms, that can certainly happen this time of year. Another area that's highlighted, and again, kind of is consistent with the pictures of flooding we saw earlier, is an area in the north that concentrated in Minnesota, but extending into North Dakota, that has been wetter than normal. But in between that, largely the state of Iowa and extending into Wisconsin and northern portions of Illinois, Indiana, and into Michigan and Ohio, some drier than normal conditions. Drier conditions have been prevailing also as we get into the western portion there from Colorado, Wyoming, up to Montana. And if we extend that out to 90 days, the pattern pretty similar qualitatively. We still see that swath where, perhaps a significant influence from the last 30 days of where it's been wetter than average from Kentucky across to Kansas, wetter than average in the upper Midwest, drier than average in that area between that splits them, and then persistent dryness in the western half. So again, fairly similar patterns whether we're looking at 30 days or 90 days. Temperatures, 30-day max and min temperatures. On the left, we're looking at departure from mean. We've got some green areas there that are running below normal, as much as about 4 or 5 degrees below normal, from parts of Illinois over into Kansas. and a little bit of cooler areas in the upper Midwest, but again, warmer than normal, running 3 to 5 degrees or so above normal in the western portion of the north central region. If we look at departure from mean of the average minimum temperatures, they're a whole lot closer to where we would expect them to be this time of year, so nothing terribly interesting there. Soil moisture on the left, shallow groundwater on the right, and these maps very much reflect the pattern we've seen in looking at precipitation. You've got some green showing up there in the southern part of the Midwest and Great Plains, and likewise in the upper Midwest and Plains, but a lot of deep red reflecting dry conditions farther west. Again, we're seeing the same pattern over and over here in different maps. So get that kind of burned into your brain here as we're going through this. If we look at the groundwater, again, that's a little bit longer time period in terms of response, but nonetheless, we're seeing roughly the same pattern. But we do see, again, this is an indication that, and we'll get to this a little bit later on in terms of drought development, but if we look back over a longer period of time, certainly going back to last year and such, there's generally been a lack of drought across the country and wetter conditions, and that's reflected a little bit more in some of that groundwater imagery that we see there. The evaporative demand drought index, or basically how thirsty is the atmosphere, so reflecting temperatures, humidity, wind speed, solar radiation, and on a hot, sunny, dry day with low humidity and a nice breeze blowing, the atmosphere wants as much water as it can get. Doesn't mean that water is available in terms of soil moisture and such, but how much, the rate at which the atmosphere would extract water from the environment. And you can see on the left side is a 1 month average, go back to mid-July, and you can see that the areas in the west that have been dry, and while again it's out of our region, but we need to kind of look beyond our region, because these when we look at dryness and such, it can certainly expand and creep into different parts of the country. But the areas that are dry are in a situation where they will dry out even more quickly given the opportunity. So it'd be very difficult to recharge in some of those areas very effectively at this point. And you can see that on the right side also, even more so in the 1 week map, where it really reflects the intense heat that has built in the western part of the country. We're going to come back and talk a little bit about the EDDI a little bit later when we take a look at the events out in Colorado. But otherwise, through much of the Midwest, the values are around normal, and that's a good thing for our crops out in the field. The exception you got there in, again, parts of Iowa, extending into Nebraska and South Dakota, but all in all, those values are pretty appealing for agriculture across the region. Stream flows, so that precipitation temperature patterns start to show up in stream flows after a period of time. On the left, you can see the 7-day average stream flows across the country, and on the right, the same map, but now averaged over a 28-day period, so it smooths out a little bit of the effect of these weather events that may be on a daily or 2 or 3 day basis. In any case, you see roughly the same pattern in both. Again, on the right side is something that shows a little bit more persistence to it, and then on the left side is showing how that may be changing as we go forward. So stream flows in the lower Ohio and middle Mississippi valleys have generally been above normal, much above normal, and some other areas there where we're seeing above normal stream flows into Kansas, and a little bit as we go farther north to the Dakotas. But as we go farther west, again, certainly as we would expect from what we've already talked about, we see stream flows that are much below normal in that region. On the Great Lakes, we have lake levels are high, in some cases near to slightly above record high, but in other cases, as we go farther east, Lake Ontario and Lake Erie a little bit lower. It's been drier as you go farther east, reflected there, and we're getting the time where we'll kind of hit a peak on those and should start kind of trending down seasonally. But otherwise, Great Lakes have been persistently high now for some time and dealing with some issues with high water levels and some coastal flooding, some minor issues with the derecho and the winds that kind of piled water up on the eastern shores there of some of the lakes, particularly like Michigan. The drought monitor updated today. On the left, you're looking at today's date, and on the right, you're looking at the drought monitor from 1 year ago. So if you look at what's happening today, the largest area certainly in the western U.S., and we can flag Colorado there, Wyoming, some dryness developing in Montana, but for our folks on this call, it's really the Colorado region that has been in significant drought and has not seen relief from that drought and are currently experiencing very, very warm and dry conditions. And otherwise, the area in Iowa, again, really stands out with some D3 extreme drought there. Probably not going to intensify from that level, but there may be some expansion of severe and extreme drought in the state going forward, and unless we see a change in precipitation pattern. Some dryness in Ohio, northern Indiana, Illinois, some areas of minor dryness, but again, the yellow shading of abnormally dry does not indicate drought conditions, but certainly suggests that things could be trending that way, and depending on conditions could change fairly quickly. On the right-hand side, though, you'll take a look at last year, and I put that up to just to remind you that if we look back to the last couple of years, we've been in a lull or minimum in terms of drought coverage across the country. Very little drought really anywhere. If we look at the percentage of the land area that was in some category of drought, it was about as low as it gets to maybe even being record low. So the fact that there's a good bit more drought on the left side and we've got a good bit of red doesn't necessarily mean things are terrible across the country, but relative to the very desirable drought conditions that we've seen over the last year or two, things are deteriorating, certainly. This map, we keep the current drought monitor map on the left, but now we're looking at how that map has changed over the last month. So you can see the areas that are shaded in the yellow, the brown, orange colors, whatever those are areas where conditions are degrading, getting drought is intensifying. And again, you see Iowa standing out there in the areas in the west. There has been improvement in drought conditions in Kansas, in far parts of Ohio and Indiana, and some minor improvements in some areas that were starting to get dry but never really got into drought per se. So really the areas that have been suffering from drought have been seeing it intensify, and that's been the key theme or takeaway from these maps. Now let's switch on. We've been looking at a kind of the big picture with a lot of maps of what's been happening across the region. Now let's focus in on a couple events, and I've got a couple slides here on the derecho that affected the Midwest, particularly Iowa, but also across to Illinois, Indiana, and into southern Michigan and Wisconsin. So the map on the left, courtesy of the National Weather Service in Chicago, really does a pretty good job of capturing the on-the-ground effects of the derecho. And you can see in the upper left radar imagery linked together to kind of show how that system progressed across the region. So looking at the lower left, the orange shaded regions are areas where winds were either measured or estimated to be 100 miles an hour plus on the ground. And that's not a huge area, but it's actually a pretty large swath that captured or did significant damage in some urban areas. So Cedar Rapids in particular was hard hit by that event. And many of you have probably gone online, seen news coverage, lots of pictures and accounts and so forth. And we don't have time to dedicate that much to addressing the event here. But we will, I'm sure, have opportunities when we come to questions later on. As that moves farther east, it's spread out.
Yeah, Stuart, I just want to make sure everybody knows this is a preliminary map. This is not the final sort of damage map by any means, or a wind map for that matter. We are discussing potentially having a webinar devoted. Dennis Toddy, who's who's on this call as well, answering questions and such from USDA. We'll maybe teaming up with NOAA and such to maybe present something in the near future on this, some of the science background and some of the damage or impact information. But we'll see, and we'll get the word out on that as soon as possible.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stuart.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. And again, there's a lot to talk about. A very dynamic situation in terms of trying to understand exactly what all the impacts were. But we know they were urban, they were rural, they were widespread in terms of agriculture, infrastructure, property, so forth throughout the region. And it will take some time before we really are able to get a really, really good handle on that. These are a few pictures that I got from Justin Glisson in Iowa and Trent Ford in Illinois. My colleagues there in the state climate offices. On the left, the area that's circled kind of shows a cornfield that has been down by the heavy winds, and on the right, again, some flooding and wind damage. Lots of concern on this, and again, we've had some discussion. We'll have opportunity at the end. But what's going to happen to all of this corn that has been damaged by that event? So again, perhaps we'll get some questions on that. The second event that I wanted to highlight are the Colorado fires and the Pine Gulch fire, Grizzly Creek fire. The Pine Gulch fire, the second largest historical record as of yesterday, and growing still. So I don't know how far it is from taking over the #1 spot, but fortunately it's in an area where there's not a lot of development, not a lot of population at risk. The Grizzly Creek fire is a different case. It's a smaller fire, but it is approximate to Interstate 70 and has forced the closure of Interstate 70 through that area. And unlike other parts of the country, certainly when you get into the Midwest, where it's a little bit easier to divert traffic off a closed interstate, that's not so easy to do in central and western portion of Colorado. So that's become a major disruption for that region. And as you can see on the left, we showed this map of the EDDI earlier in talking about how thirsty the atmosphere is for water. You could interpret that also as those deep red colors as an indication of how rapidly the risk of fire danger is increasing, how rapidly the atmosphere is trying to dry out the landscape and the environment. So this fire risk is not likely to disappear anytime soon. And as many of you know from media coverage, there are a number of fires burning in California and such, so resources are being stretched thin.
And one point of clarification, the Pine Gulch fire is the second largest in Colorado's historical record. Just want to make sure everybody understood that.
Yes, thank you, Doug. Moving on to agriculture, kind of focus on corn and soybeans as being key crops through its region, but also really honing in on the derecho and its impacts. So on the left, we have the most recent update from USDA on corn conditions. So it's the percent that is good or good to excellent corn on the left, and on the right, the percent that is poor to very poor. And when you look at the maps, the pleasing thing about it is that in many states, those numbers are in the 80s, 70s, 80s in terms of good to excellent corn. So there are a lot of folks out there that are, have an indication and hoping that they'll be able to make it through to a very good harvest this year with a good crop. The numbers below in the parentheses reflect the change from last week. And you can see the Iowa number there. And again, Iowa standing out as a bullseye at 59% good excellent. And that's a 10-point drop from last week. Again, these numbers are still very volatile, I suspect. People are trying to still get a real handle on what all of the impacts are. So I don't know, that number may turn out to be pretty accurate, but I suspect that there are a lot of people that are still really trying to get a handle on those impacts. On the right side, again, you can basically see the flip side of that, the percentage that is poor to very poor, and you can see the increase there in Iowa that's occurred. You can also see, again, corn not a major crop so much, nationwide in Colorado, but you can see the flip side to that, where there's been some rain in the eastern part of Colorado that has been beneficial, but some of that has also come in very heavy events with a lot of runoff and such, so probably not having as much impact as would be desired. Soybeans, again, similar picture. Qualitatively, it's been a good year for most folks around the region. But over the last week, some areas, in particular Iowa, has seen some degradation in terms of the quality of the crop. Pasture conditions, generally pretty good in the eastern half, not so much in the western half, and deteriorating in Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana over the last week. So pretty significant deterioration, and that is likely to continue with the very hot, dry conditions that are prevailing in that part of the country. And then some other crops that are important in various states, and all in all, pretty good conditions for a high percentage of crops that are in good to excellent condition, whether we're talking about barley, sorghum, or spring wheat conditions, and focusing on our region, the exception there being sorghum in Colorado. So now let's move on to outlooks. We'll start out by highlighting the hurricane outlook. It was recently updated. It's already been an active hurricane season, and it's expected to continue to be very active. The expectation is that we will end up with somewhere between 19 and 25 named storms, and 7 to 11 of those being hurricanes, 3 to 6 of those major hurricanes. We've had 9 named storms as of this time. Normally it would be about 2, and we would normally not get to 9 storms until sometime in October. So the conditions are very favorable. I won't go through and read all of those, but conditions in the Atlantic and Caribbean area and this general circulation, and as we move toward a possible La Nina situation, just lots of things that are coming together to suggest that we would expect a likelihood of a very active season to continue.
And do you want to suggest why that's important for us in the sort of where we live?
Yeah, so certainly those hurricanes, depending on whether they make landfall and where they do, could bring some, in many cases, much needed rains. through the Mississippi Valley, and into the Midwest, and pushing into parts of the Great Plains. So again, those are kind of long shot odds for anybody in terms of where a storm might hit, what the impacts might be. So as they move farther north, we typically have a little bit less wind damage, though it's certainly possible. There can be some negative aspects in terms of flooding if we get too much rain. But for the most part, given that these storms occur in the late summer to fall, usually those rains are welcome within the region. Then moving on to La Nina. So I think this has been a theme for the last few months, that there's some hint that we may see development of La Nina conditions, and La Nina watch has been and remains in effect. If we look at the outlook here, we can see that the odds favor La Nina development as we go forward into the fall season. Becomes more than 50% in the August, September, October window, and increases as typical as we get into the winter months before dropping off. But again, it's certainly not a slam dunk that we're going to see that develop. There's still a pretty reasonable scenario that we stay in a neutral condition over the next several months. So we'll continue to wait and see how that plays out. The INSO signal just doesn't seem to want to play its hand quite yet. 7-day outlook, quantitative precipitation forecast. Got some hope for some rain in Colorado, some areas where they could use it quite a bit. Again, likely to be pretty localized in terms of amounts. Up to this point, there have been thunderstorms in the area, but a lot of them have been dry thunderstorms where the rain evaporates before it reaches the surface. Again, the lightning strikes causing fires and such. Otherwise, areas in the eastern portion of the region, Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio, and the upper Midwest there, from Wisconsin, Minnesota, and then some hope for some rain in Iowa. But again, we're looking at amounts that would typically be less than an inch, maybe half an inch and such, but with locally heavier amounts.
And Stuart,
Yeah.
go back, would you? And just
Sure.
explain, this is a culmination of 7 days added together.
Yes.
For precipitation.
Yes.
This is not a 1-day, 2-day thing. This is
That's right.
7 days all together.
Yeah.
And you can see by the lighter shades, that's hardly any rain. Lighter shades of green.
Yes. In most areas, yes. In most areas,
very
little rain at all.
Extremely dark red and yellow, even 10 plus inches in near Florida. So just want to let everybody sort of understand that a little better.
Yes,
thank you.
That's an excellent point. So when you start talking about an inch of rain over a week this time of year, it doesn't have too much effect in terms of changing things, especially with the evapotranspiration taking place. So thanks for the clarification. I think that provides a good context there, Doug. 8 to 14-day outlooks. Much of the Midwest has enjoyed and is expecting to continue to enjoy some below normal temperatures or near normal temperatures, and heat expected to continue in the Southwest, so enhanced likelihoods there of above normal temperatures. Precipitation wise, on the right side, enhanced likelihood of wetter than normal conditions in the east, just slightly enhanced, with likelihood of drier conditions being prevailing over the Intermountain West and extending into Colorado, so the area where we certainly need some rain. So 8 to 14-day outlook, and then we move on to September. So the 8 to 14 days will pretty much take us through the rest of the month. And we look at the September outlook, temperature-wise, warmer than normal conditions likely to persist in the west, with equal chances of above, near, or below normal in parts of the Midwest and plains. again, basically equal chances, not really a strong guidance as to what might happen there. And then precipitation-wise, again, continued dryness in the west. So really seeing, when we look at the western U.S. right now, we're looking at persistence being the key word. The seasonal outlook, September, October, November, enhanced likelihood of above normal temperatures throughout the country, more so in the west, less so in the upper plains down through a good swath of the Midwest region. Drier conditions, more likely than not in the western half of the north central region, and otherwise equal chances through the rest of the region, Midwest and plains. And if we look out 3 months step farther into the winter season, December, January, February, the signal here, while we're still in a La Nina watch, is broadly consistent with the La Nina development. And that would be warmer conditions to the south and drier conditions across the south. So that's certainly something to keep an eye on, given the drought conditions that exist or are developing in the southern tier. And again, that's outside our region, but we know that that can creep in and affect our weather and climate in the north central region. And then typically in a La Nina situation, the Ohio River Valley area has above normal precipitation, and we have an enhanced likelihood of that elsewhere across the upper plains in the upper Midwest. Wildland fire potential outlook for the month of August. Again, we're halfway through. It's below normal in the east, above normal in the northwest. But again, even though we have the fires burning in Colorado, they're very significant. We're currently classified as in the normal category and also in the outlook for September. So that reflects the fact that things are very dry, but at the same time, what we're seeing in terms of fires starting is not unusual for this time of year. And it's somewhat random as to where a fire starts and such. But we have some very significant fires occurring within Colorado now. So there's some hope that that persistent pattern will break down going forward, and we'll get a little bit of relief. But as of now, that's the fire potential outlook. And then the U.S. seasonal drought outlook, expecting persistent drought with some expansion or development likely in the western regions, and some hope that we may see some improvement elsewhere in the Midwest, and again, honing in on Iowa. So summarizing, drought continues to expand in western areas and intensify in Iowa, while other areas in drought have shown improvement. Temperatures have continued to run well above normal, and combined with dry conditions are increasing fire risk, again, mainly focusing on western regions. A very active hurricane season is expected, with the potential to impact portions of the region. The best impact would be increased precipitation in some areas that could use some rain. A La Nina watch continues. And again, if that develops, those impacts typically come a little bit later, and again, may show up when we get into the winter months a little bit more clearly. Warmer and drier than normal conditions are likely to persist in western areas on a seasonal perspective, with drought persisting and expanding in area. And cooler and wetter than normal conditions are expected across much of the Midwest over the near term. So that kind of summarizes a lot of things we've talked about. For additional information, you can take a look at some of our partner websites, and I won't go down through all of these, but if you've been on the calls, you see these on a month-to-month basis, and hopefully are very familiar with our partners. And we'll have a panel of folks that are available. Not sure all of those folks are on the call. I hope they are, but have questions, again, as Doug indicated, you can type those in, and we'll come back and try to answer those here in the next few minutes.
Let's go right back. Yeah, thank you very much. Let's go right back to the seasonal outlook, if you will. First of all, thanks, Stuart, for being the presenter this month. It's very helpful. So I didn't introduce myself. Some of you know me, some of you don't. I'm Doug Cluck. I work for NOAA, National Centers for Environmental Information. I'm in Kansas City, Missouri. Dennis Toddy with USDA Ag Hubs based out of Ames. I was also on. So we're here to talk a little bit more and enhance what Stuart said, or if any questions come up. We had a number of questions. We tried to answer some of them, but some of the, oops, I missed one of them in there. Anyway, first of all, I want to say that all the slides are available in PDF form eventually. And if you get the email that I invite you to come to this webinar series, you can, I mean, you'll see that there are two links, two different places at the regional climate centers that you can go access the PDF files and or the recording. We're recording this whole thing. So if you don't know where that is, or if you need the slides and you can't figure out how to get on that email list, just email me at doug.cluck@noaa.gov, and I'll either put you on my list and send you all the stuff that I send everybody else, or you can just get the PDF file one way or the other, whatever you want. Let's see, that was one question. Okay, so I'm not sure we ever got an answer to this, but one of the main questions was, to what depth does the GRACE-based characterization for soil moisture, and you might actually go back to that since we're talking about it. I guess we can just come back to this seasonal outlook in just a minute. It's the shallow GRACE-based characterization, there it is, of precipitation, and this will actually lead to some of the other questions that we have. My inkling is that it goes about 4 inches, but I don't know how I know that, and that's not based on something I just read 5 minutes ago either. So it's like they say, it is shallow. It's not supposed to be, well, that would be so much. So maybe I'm wrong completely. We'll have to get back to you on that, Matt, unless Dennis has another answer. Did you ever find anything on that?
I went looking, and on their websites, they did not define what the levels were, unfortunately. So I apologize, but I couldn't come up with it.
Well, based on the way it looks, Dennis, what would you say? Is that a deep moisture, shallow, middle moisture, or shallow? It says shallow, so I'm
yeah. Based on what it's looking like right here, that has to still be relatively deep, because it's indicating parts of Iowa as being wet, and I can tell you anything in the top 3 to 4 feet in Iowa is not wet. So it must be something below that level, maybe in a 5, 6, 7 feet, something like that. Partially that's going to depend on your, the geomorphology of the location, what your soil type is like, that sort of thing.
Well, the reason I said it led into another question. One of the questions was, okay, did the derecho solve or exacerbate or whatever some of the issues for dryness in western Iowa, because there was a pretty good rainstorm along with that. Do you want to answer that one, Dennis?
Well, it solved some issues. It destroyed crops that were drought stressed, so that made it very simple. There in the driest part of the state of western Iowa, it was maybe an inch or an inch and a half. A nice rain to have, but it would not fix the situation. Some of the heavier rainfalls were in the eastern part of the state where conditions are not as bad yet. Net result of the derecho was very negative, much more damage than the rainfall that it brought along with it, unfortunately.
Right. As it moved further and further east, that means out of, let's say, Cedar Rapids, and the winds did begin to become less, and the rainfall more important, I guess, in those areas it certainly helped, right?
Right. And some of the dryness in those areas is not as severe as western Iowa where it started.
Yeah. So I had another question about a direction of winds in a derecho, and the answer to that is generally they're in the same direction. In other words, it's not a twisting wind. It's a straight line wind, we call it, from one direction. In this case, if you looked at the radar, maybe go to that radar image and some of the plots of damage, you can see that it was basically from west to east. It's almost always some westerly direction, from a westerly direction is the best way to say that. And that's very typical of derecho winds. Now, let's see. Will La Nina conditions during harvest make a delayed harvest more likely or less likely due to wet? Will it be, in other words, will it become too wet to harvest, and is that going to be a worry? Dennis?
It sure doesn't look like there is big chances for rainfall to delay harvest. The harvest will probably be, especially in Iowa, fairly lengthy because we're probably going to start harvesting fairly soon as some crops start to dry out, and some of the damaged crops, whatever happens to them happens, so they need to start harvesting those. Most areas of the Corn Belt are at worst close to average, if not ahead of average, so I would expect harvest will be starting relatively early. And as I recall, it looked like things were going to be likely warmer, and at worst, they were going to be equal chances for precipitation, if not some dryness. So it should not, I think the only thing that would slow harvest down this time is going to be dealing with damaged crops. I would assume harvest would move along at a relatively good pace once things reach maturity. And with warmer conditions, we're probably going to reach maturity a little bit earlier than average.
Okay. I had a quick question from on South Central Missouri. Someone was focused on that, and the QPF, if you want to go to the QPF outlooks next, Stuart, basically showed Missouri being dry, right, over the next 7 days. And how likely is that to be? It was basically the question. And I said it's tough for Missouri to go dry like that for an entire week this time of year, but it can happen. It looks like things will change the second week. So not the first 7 days, not today through next Thursday, but certainly beyond that, it does look like a wetter signal. As Stuart said, short term, some cooler air coming in from the north, and maybe some fronts sort of laid up, if you will, across Missouri and the Midwest, which will be helpful to most people. And then here's another one. Boy, I don't know how to answer this. Maybe somebody on the one of our other guys can help. Is there a chance that Genevieve, that Hurricane Genevieve or whatever it is, by the time it gets here, getting relief from that in some way, I think is the question there. And I don't know, if someone wants to look that up and comment. And yes, we are recording this. If so, where, when? Yeah. So write me an email, doug.cluck@noaa.gov. Otherwise, I did post a couple places in these questions. Maybe you can go back and look at it. Maybe you can't because you got in late. But there are a couple different sites that you can go to at the regional climate centers to get both the PDF file of this and the recording. And again, if you don't know how to do that, just write me at my name, doug.cluck@noaa.gov, and I'll help you. This is for you, Dennis. Any thoughts on why rain patterns manage to avoid western Corn Belt areas like Iowa?
Doug, first you glossed over Genevieve, and
go ahead.
I seem to recall the CPC call the other day talking about this was not a time of year where they tend to recurve and bring moisture back, but they continue on out of the Pacific. seems like I remember that discussion.
Okay.
So I call that. Why is moisture missing the Western Corn Belt? I don't have a good answer for you, because it is a very, if you look at the drought monitor map, there's a very focused area where we're missing rainfall, which is focused on Western Iowa, and then some areas adjacent to it now, much of Eastern Iowa, expanding into southeastern Wisconsin and parts of eastern Nebraska. There is an impact when your surface has dried out. Crops don't transpire as much moisture. There's not as much moisture evaporating from the surface. So when disturbances do come around, they don't have as much water to work with. So there is some factor there. Otherwise, I don't have a good answer for you as to why we're specifically missing out this year. There are tendencies every year. There is some area that has some drought overall, but it seems to be Iowa's turn this year, Western Iowa's turn.
Yeah, and I don't know what people's memory is, but in 2017 there was a, if you will, D3, D4 drought from eastern Kansas north and, well, east and north into southern Iowa across a lot of northern Missouri, which was, as you see, D4, D3 is the worst it can be in terms of drought. And it was very localized for the most part, localized. And so it happens. It's probably just the best way we can say it without.
I guess a counter to that, a kind of flip side of that is when you look down again at the Ohio Valley and Kentucky and Indiana and Ohio and such, is that we've had a couple of occasions this year where we've had stalled frontal boundaries in the region, and with advection of moisture from the Gulf and from a closer distance and such, and those stalled boundaries, it's really contributed to excess precipitation in those areas. So, having that happen here as opposed to in Iowa, kind of is a one explanation for why it has rained here and not somewhere else in the region.
Yep. All right, Dennis, mainly you, I think, on this one. Any chance, and I think this actually may answer a couple different questions, any chance to save the corn or anything else that was flattened?
Yes and no. It depends on how badly the corn was damaged. If corn was completely snapped off, it's done. There's nothing else more that can be done with it. Unfortunately, there's a lot more corn that was not snapped off, but is pushed over. And once it's past its tasseling, it really doesn't have as much chance to be able to pull itself back up, because crops can't, or corn can pull themselves back up to a certain extent. So that is the first off is how much of it falls in that second category, not the first category, and how much yield are we losing because of that. And then the other part, been talking with some of the agronomic folks, is the difficulty there is going to be in harvesting this. Because it is tipped over, some of it you may only be able to harvest going one direction, so that slows down your harvest progress. You'll have to go very slowly, and it may be very difficult to harvest. And the problem we're dealing with is that the current issues, or the current requirements with crop insurance, are you have to harvest and see what you get for yield, and then your settlement is then based on what you get for yield. Even if they were not able to, then you still got to get rid of that crop somehow. And that's a real problem. So there's lots of numbers being tossed around right now. It's still too early to be able to say very well as to what numbers those are really going to be.
And why do you have to go so slow when you're harvesting sort of knocked over or damaged crops when you're harvesting? Because your equipment is set to have a standing stock, and to be able to move quickly through that standing stock, harvest that, and pull the
pull the ear off and all this sort of thing. When it's laying all over the place, you can't move as quickly because the crop won't move through the fingers of the combine nearly as well as when it's standing upright. So you have to slow down. Corn is a little bit better because it can still stay somewhat upright and you can get the fingers of the combine down underneath it. Soybeans, I've heard people get really upset about because they're a lower plant to begin with, and if they're knocked over, you're almost digging in the dirt to try to get the soybean out if it's been damaged. And to that end, there has been some soybean damage. Doesn't look like soybean damage was nearly as bad as some of the corn was.
Okay. Just back to the hurricane just for a minute. I forgot that Genevieve was off the west coast of the U.S. And presently there is a big high ridge of pressure over the western U.S., which may, if you will, it's probably not a good thing, but direct that, as Dennis said, out to sea more than recurving. It does look like it is moving north and west, but the prediction is that it's going to stay out to the west. Now, some of that moisture may eventually get into the southwest, but that may take a while. Dennis, you're on camera, by the way. I see you. In South Dakota, Nebraska, the dark blue seems to be following the boundaries of the Ogallala Aquifer. And I'm not sure what we're referring. Maybe it's that, yeah. Yeah, so I'm going to say that is relatively consequential or inconsequential, and just a lucky, that's where the storms happen to be, or the moisture happens to be. Now, it could be that some of that area is being picked up on that Grace groundwater thing. There's plenty of other places that aren't dark blue too. So, and we did have a comment about someone being somewhat skeptical about the Grace product in here, especially in western Iowa. I'm going to move on because we're almost done with time here. Can you speak to harvest weather outlook for the northern plains? If you want to say anything about that or guesstimate anything about that, Dennis?
I mean, it looks like it's going to be warm, so we're going to move crop conditions along. You know, I don't. Right now, I think, Stuart, can you go to the outlook and just refresh my memory as to what you know, it doesn't look like there are calls for it to be wetter than average. There has been a tendency for this area to be wetter than average. There's been a trend over time. It doesn't look like that's necessarily going to be the case right now. So, I mean, we don't see any major hazards one way or the other right now.
Okay. There's just a couple other points to add on to what you said earlier about corn being knocked over and harvested. You know, there's a grain quality issue. Along with that, someone commented, and someone had to deal with this around 3 years ago, and you could also end up combining a majority of the corn in one direction, which slows the process because you have to go around, come back, go around, come back, which would be very slow, I can imagine. Texas, Kansas, Ogallala Aquifer sector is in the dry coloring on the Grace graphics. Okay, yeah, good point. I see. And then someone said, thanks for the presentation. So I think that's it. We're a little past 2. I'm gonna cut it off unless anybody has one more comment here. Fall harvest conditions. Some corn in southern South Dakota could reach black layer around September 1st, which is coming up quick. Yeah. So, in other words, some crops are ahead of time due to, I guess, what, relatively warm temperatures. Dennis?
Yes, warm temperatures, and in some cases, like in Iowa, we will probably get mature earlier than expected just because they're going to run out of water. The only place that's really been a little bit slower is in the Eastern Corn Belt, and they're catching up now too.
All right. And on that note, we're going to leave on that semi-positive note, I guess, and say thank you to everybody who participated today. And we will be back on the 17th, not the 15th of September. If you need any more information, feel free to contact any of us. We're here to help. And thank you again, Stuart and Dennis. Have a great day.